Thank you, Ruth. My name's Sandy Beach, and I'm an alcoholic, and I'm from Alexandria, Virginia, and I'm delighted that you honored Julie and I by asking us to come down here to your wonderful convention. I think it's been marvelous, and I'm looking forward to the rest of it. I came into Alcoholics Anonymous on Pearl Harbor Day in 1964, and I haven't been drunk since my first meeting. I've had a lot of chance to think about that, been to a lot of open meetings, closed meetings where this has been discussed, and it's my sincere belief that the reason that I haven't been drunk is because I haven't been doing any drinking. I like to get that out of the way in case there's anybody new to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and you're wondering about sobriety and so on down. Not drinking is a significant factor in sobriety, in my opinion. It is... It seems to supersede a lot of things in the program when you really get down to basics. And I had a real good friend from up in our area who, when asked how he worked the steps, used to always say, when all else fails, don't drink. And this, to me, has paid great dividends in those moments when the Serenity Prayer upsets me. And you just hang in there. I love that cartoon of the little cat hanging on the straw. Hang in there, baby, you know. You have one of those days when you're not going to make any progress, but you don't want to slip backwards, so that's how you hang in there. It's the old not drinking routine. And I got this from my sponsor, who was another Marine. He's a very mean guy, and he hammered these points home very strongly. And he told me something that I always have liked to use, and that is that whenever you have the privilege of speaking at an AA meeting, to talk as if there was someone in the audience at their first meeting. And you will put yourself at ease, and you will talk about pertinent issues, such as staying sober and some of that stuff, you know, which to me is rather important, because my definition of alcoholism is in my case, was that it is something that bothered me. This is my definition. You can have your own definition, but that's what I like to think about it, and had nothing to do with lack of willpower or my morals or anything like that, because we certainly don't want to go into them. It had to do with the fact that it bothered me. It was getting in the way of my life. It was ruining it. It was a horrible situation, and so that's what being an alcoholic was. And AA has changed all that, and there were a lot of basics, and if I talk to someone who's at their first convention, early into their AA life, maybe I can share with you some of these basics that have stayed with me over the years and I think are so important. And I call that initial entry into AA, if you're anything like I was when I was brand new, the temporary membership in Alcoholics Anonymous. This, as I recall, I like to look at the different stages of AA membership, and I remember being a temporary member as a person who is here trying to make up his or her mind whether we are really an alcoholic, because in most of our cases we don't have the evidence to support the fact that we really are an alcoholic. If you're like me, you possibly got here under duress. You possibly got here under pressure from a spouse or a boss or a judge or a sheriff or something, you know. I have yet to meet the speaker who stands up here and says, well, I was sitting around my living room one night and I got to thinking about my drinking, and it appeared to me that if I continued, there was possible trouble in the future. And rather than put myself through any of this possible trouble, I think I'll go to AA. No. We get here at gunpoint. That's how we get into Alcoholics Anonymous. We're sitting at our first meeting wishing we were anywhere else in the world but here at Alcoholics Anonymous, because you know what happens at that first meeting? Somebody mentions not drinking. And it scares the hell out of us. And then they keep talking about it like it's fun and like it's a way of life, and they try and sugarcoat the pill, and they say, we only don't drink today. But we know damn well that guy wants to stay sober for years and years and years. He's not fooling me about that day at a time. I was sat out there at those early meetings, guys up there with 10 years sobriety. He says, I just stay sober today. And I said, yeah, well, how the hell did you stay sober 10 years? Wow, I saw that it was a very frightening concept to think about not drinking. And so I didn't want to be at my first meeting. And if you're new to Alcoholics Anonymous, you may be in that decision-making stage where we are temporary members. We have not accepted our disease. We have not fully admitted. We really are on the fence. We're still rationalizing. We're still using our own brain, which is a very dangerous thing. That's why we got all these steps in the big book and all that. We'll use the brain later on, but it's very dangerous to use it during that first stage. And I have certain identifying features that I feel a temporary member to Alcoholics Anonymous has. I'll tell you how I can remember. One, a temporary member always knows to the exact second how much time is left in the meeting. So you can get the hell out of there, you know what I mean? It's just, oh boy, 11 and a half minutes to go, and I'm gone, I'm out of here. Whew. And we sit near the back, and we don't get here early. We don't talk to anybody. We don't tell anybody our name. We're just putting in our appearance so that whoever sent us here will know that we've been logged in. Another thing a temporary member does not want to do is listen. That could be extremely dangerous because some of the speakers in AA are kind of persuasive, and who knows, they may have us raising our hand and volunteering to join this outfit. And when you want to retain the option to leave, you certainly don't want to be influenced by someone who's prejudiced. So that's another thing. So if you're not going to listen while you're killing the hour, you have to do things. You have to do things to amuse yourself and get rid of this time to go by. Some of the things that I did as a temporary member was to count the audience. I wouldn't try and do it here, but in an average group, there may be 17 rows of 13 people in a row. And being a college graduate, I wouldn't count all the people. I'd simply multiply 17 times 13, which in the first 3 months that you're in Alcoholics Anonymous takes the entire hour to multiply 13 times 17. So that kills the hour right there. And another thing is to estimate the collection. You listen to the coins and the dollars and check with the secretary or the treasurer afterwards and see how close you came and leave. But anything to avoid throwing the towel in and going along with something that is a great threat to our own way of life. And our own way of life is very special to us because we thought it up. We are the designer of this blueprint for living that we have been using until we get to AA. And even though it includes a small amount of vomiting, we're rather reluctant to change this blueprint because our favorite person is the designer of that blueprint. He is one of the more intelligent people in the world put this thing together. And just because it seems to have a few flaws right now, it's something that can be ironed out later. And here we're being threatened with a challenge to throw in all our old ideas. When somebody got up here and said our old ideas avail us nothing, we must dump them all, I said, well, you didn't have my old ideas, man. If you had my ideas, you wouldn't be dumping them all. I mean, what are you telling me? So Alcoholics Anonymous was a big threat to me when I got here. And so if you are new and you feel this way, that's good. That's great, as a matter of fact, because the greatest favor that can happen to you is that old way gets so threatened and so riddled with holes that you finally abandon it, and you will find that when you do, the battle is more than half won. Because if there's anything that separates the person from the benefits of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's clinging to that 200-pound weight around our shoulders called our old way of life. And the quicker we can throw it in, the happier we're going to be. I'll tell you a little bit about my debate with myself in this process, and you will see possibly why this program is so magnificent, in that it conquered a guy whose brain was obviously seriously damaged, still is, but I'm not drinking now, and I don't display the symptoms that give me away, you know what I mean? I'm in real estate up in Alexandria, and I deal with clients all the time, and they have no way of knowing that I used to be in a nut ward. There's no clue to give this out. There's no way. But all I would have to do is take one drink, and I think the cat would be out of the bag, and they would know right off that they were dealing with a weird person, and they had better leave for their own safety. My decision-making process, evaluating ideas in my first month in Alcoholics Anonymous, as I sat at meeting after meeting with a sponsor who insisted that I go every night, was that the speakers were very interesting, that the program was intellectually very interesting, but it didn't apply to me. That was the problem. I could see where it applied to all the other people, but it did not apply to me because I did not have enough evidence to support the fact that I belonged here in Alcoholics Anonymous, here in a sheltered world, here in a place, a cocoon where I could hide. I saw this as a great cop-out from the world of reality, and I'll touch on this later, on what a mistaken impression this was and how it really is exactly the opposite of that. But I would sit at meetings and grade speakers, give them a 75 to an 80 or an 85, depending on their vocabulary and diction and so on down. Nothing to do with their meaning, nothing to do with their effectiveness of swinging me over to their way of thinking, and offered great resistance to this. I wouldn't read any of the literature. I just was here to buy enough time to get the pressure off so that I could go back out and figure it out myself, because this to me was the great American dream. Every man is his own captain. Everybody figures out his own ideas, and to ask for help is a sign of weakness. Somewhere I was brought up with this concept that to ask for help is a sign of weakness. I'd like to find the person who told me this and show him how weak I am. But this came in possibly from parents, possibly from literature, movies. This was great. movies. I identified with movies where the Western hero lived all alone out in the desert with his horse. And every couple of months in town there'd be trouble. So somebody would ride out and get this hero. And he would come riding into town on his horse. And he always had gloves on. You ever see a guy with gloves? I mean, he always had gloves on. And he'd walk into the bar and pull those gloves up, order a drink, never talk to anybody, just have the drink it down, walk out, shoot the bad guy, get on the horse, go back out of town. Everybody would go, oh, wow, what a man, what a man. And that was my hero. It's really weird living alone in the desert with a horse. If you really think about it, what the hell did he do all the time? That he wasn't drinking and shooting people. I mean, this is... But this was my hero, He was a man's man. There he was. Didn't need anybody. Self-sufficient. The great philosophy of self-sufficiency that this 12 and 12 tells us does not pay off. Well, to me, I thought that was it. And this is the great American dream, was to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and climb to the top in the great competitive society and move along and so on down. As a youngster, I was raised in New England by rather conservative New England parents whose, I think they were trying to instill in me sort of a atmosphere of growing up to be a snob. I think this was their purpose, or this is what they were after, a little snob there. Simultaneously, in total opposition to this, and Sister Maurice will have to forgive me for this, in total opposition to this particular plan of upbringing was a group of nuns with whips. Who were trying to tell me I was nothing. I came walking in there getting ready to be a snob, and they said, "You got original sin." And I went, "Oh, that's trouble, huh? You better believe it's trouble. Wait till we tell you the full ramifications of original sin." And when I found out the full ramifications of original sin, I was a little nervous about things, because I was less comfortable than before I found out I had original sin. And then we sat in those front rows, and, the funny thing is, there was all these little kids in those front rows there listening to about God, and I'm sure the rest of them, or most of them, sat there and listened to it and found it interesting and helpful and so on down. But not me. My eyes were as big as saucers. And I heard about purgatory, and I heard about hell, and I heard about sin, and I felt so guilty that I started cringing down in those seats and started a little of the trembling on the inside, which was very difficult because I was trying to be a snob. And I had a conflict going there. I had the outside bravado of walking around like this, and the inside was disintegrating. And I hadn't started drinking yet. I mean, I was, wow, I was ready for alcohol. I was also told about sins that we could create on our own. And I heard about them, and I was told that even thinking about some of them was severely punishable. And I realized just out of the blue that at even 8 or 9 years old, that I was already guilty of many of these things. These thoughts, I seemed to have no control over my thoughts and what I would dwell on. And I would see things and think things, and I'd go, cut that out up there, you know. You costed me a lot of time in purgatory just doing that. I seemed to have a self-destruct system going before I found alcohol. And I do believe alcoholics are self-destructive. Oh, what a problem. My calculations showed that age 14 I had roughly 82,000 years to do in purgatory. And I hadn't even started any of the action yet, you know what I mean? So the things weren't coming through right to me, obviously. The receiver was broken. It just wasn't coming through right, because I can remember somebody saying, you know what happens when you die? And I said, I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear. They said, oh, it's wonderful. You get to meet God. And I went, oh, no, no. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Oh, no, that's the last thing I want to do. I don't want to meet God. And yet I was told that God was a loving force and so on down. And I could accept that as the truth for everybody else except me. I did believe that God did love everybody else, but he didn't like me. And you know why I knew that he didn't like me? Because I didn't like me. That's why I knew he didn't like me. And I knew me better than anybody. And so I had to keep this a secret. And this was one of my secrets that I had when I was trying to be a snob, was that I didn't like me and God didn't like me. And I was in serious trouble. And things were coming apart inside. And I was guilty about guilty. And everybody else was all right. This was one of the fatal assumptions I made as a very young kid, was that everybody else had life just where they wanted it. And the reason I made this assumption was nobody ever told me that life was bothering them. Whenever I would ask, how you doing, everybody, you know, the classical answer, fine, doing fine, everything's going good, I'm rolling along. Now that I've been in Alcoholics Anonymous these years, I've decided that I would rather be me than anybody. And I don't say this in some great sense of an ego trip. I just found out how much trouble you all have. And I don't really know if I want to switch. I got a mess inside here, but I'm going to stick with it because, damn my luck, I'd switch with someone who's got a worse mess. This was the opening up here in AA of somebody else standing up and admitting that they had missed the lecture on how to live when they were in grammar school and went through 43 years not being able to handle emotions that some 13-year-olds are coping with beautifully. At about age 18, I entered university in New Haven. I had not had a drink yet. I was still trying to be a snob. I was very nervous about everything. My self-esteem was minus. And I always had the feeling that a perfect stranger would come up to me on the sidewalk and say, That's my spot. And I go, oh. I say, oh, I'm sorry, and I didn't mean to be standing there. That was how, what I thought of myself. I was invited to a cocktail party, and there were approximately 40 people, all freshmen from various parts of the country, very distinguished looking, all dressed in their suits and ties. Everything was proper, and I can remember being extremely apprehensive. I was so apprehensive when I was in front of a crowd of more than two that it was just unbearable, extremely nervous. And I walked into this room, and there were 40, 50 people. They were all standing around having drinks and polite conversation. And I sensed the hostility towards me the second I walked in the room. I just saw heads turning. Hey, did you know he was here? Get the guy out. He's never been here before. Why should he be here now? He's not welcome. Absolute hostility. I saw eyes that had fire coming out of them, looking at me and burning through my head. And someone gave me a drink. I don't remember what it was. It had whiskey in it. It was in a glass. It had ice. And I drank it. And that drink had no effect on me whatsoever. But boy, did it change all the people in that room. By the time I finished that drink and it had had its chance to make its appointed rounds, the atmosphere in the room started changing into one of warmth. The people's eyes suddenly turned friendly, and there were smiles appearing on their faces, and there were hands being stuck forward to be shaken, and arms around the shoulder, and a sense of well-being and belonging and a peace within myself that I had never experienced before. And so I had another drink. And now they wanted to talk to me. One of them wanted me to tell a joke, and I told it, and they laughed, and they said, oh, you're a wonderful person. And the more I drank, the better people they became. And the more I drank, the more my world changed into one of the happiest worlds that I can imagine. For the first time in my life, I found myself at peace inside, at peace with my fellow man, at peace with God, at peace with the universe. I was at peace with everything. And that was my first night of drinking. And this feeling, this wonderful glow, this wonderful sense of everything being all right lasted for an hour. It was an hour's worth of this feeling. And then I started throwing up. And you know how that goes. And the rooms are going around, and I'm in a bed, and I can't stay there, and it was just terrible. It lasted all night long. The next day I'm in a classroom with 200 people. The professor is lecturing, and I can remember this was my first experience with this horrible situation that I was to become very, very familiar with. I was focusing every bit of mental and physical energy that I could muster to stay on my chair. That's all I was trying to do. I did not dare break my concentration for a second to listen to the professor or to take notes or do anything for fear that I would fly off the chair or something would tip over, because the room was moving. And someone was messing with the thermostat and running the temperature up to 150 degrees, and I was sweaty, and then they ran it down, and 50 below, and I was getting chills, and my skin was itchy and scratching, and I thought I must have got into poison ivy, and my stomach was alternating between this way and that way, and sweating and confused and sick, and it lasted most of the day, and I just could not understand what had happened. And at 5 o'clock, this same group of people came back and said, Sandy, there's another cocktail party at 5 o'clock tonight, and we're all going over there, and you seem to have a nice time last night. Why don't you join us? And my body said, no. My body said, don't go there, don't go there. But my brain, which happened to be in control at that time, it didn't realize it was about to lose control, but it was in charge of this package. And the brain said, wait a minute, body, let's think this over. Let's not make a snap decision about going over there just because you're not feeling too good right now. Let's step back and objectively look at the facts. Whenever we hear an alcoholic say, let's step back and objectively look at the facts, we know what's coming. And I stepped back and objectively looked at the facts and came to the following conclusion, that yes, I had suffered a little bit of physical illness. There, there's a little bit of this being sick. But when you really look at it, it was a small price to pay for that hour I had the night before. And this very decision is the one that I stayed with until I got into Alcoholics Anonymous. That lie, which I started that very first day I drank, was to be the eternal lie until I came to AA. This is a small price to pay for all the fun that I'm having. And in typical alcoholic story, the fun got smaller, the trouble got worse, and the equation still balanced. And there's only one way that can happen, and that was that my ability to rationalize got better and better and better until I finally reached the point where in flight school somewhere down around Corpus Christi, Texas, when I was over in Mexico over 3 days. I don't know what the hell I was doing over there, but my wife didn't think it was too funny, whatever I was doing over there. And I was in a blackout, and I was in jail, and my teeth had been knocked out again. I was constantly turning around into a fast-moving fist. And I go back and get the caps put on and a few stitches in the lips. For a Marine, I have an 0-10 fight record. And I don't even want to try for 11, so forget it. Yeah, the Army's better than the Marine Corps. The Navy's better than... I don't want to argue. But I remember this as a classic example of how quickly the rationalization took over, was that I did not remember getting locked up in this jail. I didn't remember what had happened over a period of the last 24 hours. All I knew was that I had been beaten up again. I was in the jail. I was missing $300. My clothes were a wreck, and I didn't know how I was going to get back to the base. And I had a conscience that took over when my wife stopped talking, or when she wasn't around. And my conscience would just start in there, and I'd try and shut that son of a gun up, but I couldn't. And it got me on this Sunday morning. I finally was let out of this thing and told, get out of here and don't come back. And my conscience out in this hot, dusty Sunday morning says to me, well, and I went, that's enough. I don't want to hear about that. He said, what the hell do you think you're doing? I said, I don't want to talk. I don't feel good. I need a beer, then I'll discuss it with you. I just not ready. And I can remember saying, okay, this looks bad. This looks bad. But when I get back and find those guys that I was with and came down here, I'm sure that they're going to tell me that I had a fantastic time, that I had a time that was equal to all of the trouble that I've had being locked up and all this misery. And with great trepidation, I got back and singled out these various individuals and went through the recall ritual. You know the recall ritual? It's where you try and get them to relive the weekend for you without telling them that you don't remember what happened. It kind of goes like this. Boy, Saturday night was really something, wasn't it? You remember that, you know? And then you hope that they'll volunteer. Yeah. And so I did enough of this soliciting and got all the information together, and it was sensational. They were telling me stories about what I was doing that were just wild. And so I finally asked this one guy, I said, well, in your opinion, I had a hell of a weekend. He said, you had a marvelous weekend. I remember saying to myself deep down inside, well, thank God, because I paid a hell of a price for that weekend. And at this point, I was balancing the equation with a rumor. And if that isn't strange, I don't know what is. I was accepting the fact of all this trouble on the fact that say-so of another person that I had had a good time. Obviously, alcohol had become a necessity, and I no longer had any choice over it. I'm a primary alcoholic. I don't think I had any choice over it after I had my very first drink. I think I just stepped over that invisible line, or I was born on the other side of the invisible line. I don't know. I never saw it. I hear a lot about it, but it'd be hard to see. A primary alcoholic is one who just never drank successfully, and that's me. My story just started bad and just went down a hill all the way. I wonder what I would have done if that first day in classroom, if somebody had said, this is your best day for a long time. That might have been a little scary, you know. I think I honestly drank socially for 10 or 15 minutes, and then that was it. I was also a natural-born follower, greatly influenced by crowds, greatly influenced by peer groups, which is why AA worked so quickly on me, you know. Thank God for that. That was one good plus for me. And, you know, where the hell would the natural-born leaders be without us? That's what I want to know. They'd be out there alone. That's where the hell they'd be. So when the crowd said, hey, crew cuts are fun, I went, a crew cut, you know? And the next day I thought, hey, a crew cut would be a great idea. I had to always make believe that I thought the idea up. The wide ties, smoking, same thing. Sandy, smoking is in. Oh, right, yeah, I've always wanted to smoke. I'm glad I thought of it. Then I went home that night and died trying to learn how to smoke. Do you remember trying to learn how to smoke? Coughing and hacking in the eyes, and till finally you could show up smoking and be part of the crowd. So it was very essential to me. I was greatly influenced by the groups. And I'm sure that's why I started drinking. That's why I didn't start sooner, was my peer group didn't start till we were in our late teens. But it was this right around the Korean War, and I think we had to go into the military for a couple of years or 3. I forget what the service obligation was. And it was a Saturday afternoon, and we were drinking, and there was 3 or 4 guys across the hall from where I lived who were going down to join the Marines. And I saw them leaving, and they said, yeah, we're going down to the recruiting station. We're going down to join the Marines. And my thought process went something like this. If I just grabbed this can of beer and followed them, I won't have to make any decision about where I'm going to go or what I'm going to do. I won't have to look up the address of some recruiting station. I won't have to go interview. I'll just follow them down. And so I did. And I went down and, boy, that was a bad move. That was a bad move. It was, damn Marine Corps. I mean, you know, they like to jump around and punch people out and run, and you know, there was a mistake. And I soon hated it. I mean, geez, that was terrible. Running, and no, never did they want to have a party and sit down. Just running and classes and exhaustion and getting in shape and all this kind of stuff. So I ended up being an officer. And I understand that was because I wasn't qualified for anything else, you know, And so there I was, a gentleman now, and I had burst through the first stage of this Marine Corps and gotten, into a little better situation where I was able to sit around with some leisure time and having a few beers and so on down, and learning about being a great infantry officer, and really not too interested in it at all. And I sat around and somebody made a comment one night that I sure drank a lot, and didn't I think it was affecting my health. And just to show you the great control I have over my life, I said, what do you mean? Would you like to make a small wager as to the condition of my health? I would be willing to bet $10 that I can pass the most strict physical there is in the world. And this other guy said, well, the only one that I know of is a flight physical. That is the most strict physical. I said, okay, so I went down and signed up for flight school in order to take the flight physical. It's the only way you could... Well, I passed the damn physical and was accepted into flight school, which added 3 years to the 2 years that I already had. But in my mind, it was a small price to pay to win the $10. So that was I rationalized that just between sips. I had no problem with that. I got on an airplane and I'd never been on one in my life. Got on an airplane to go to Pensacola, Florida to become the great fighter pilot of the world. And I threw up all the way down on the airplane. And I will mention now that throwing up was such a part of my story, if I left it out, I'd be finished. Right now, God, did I throw up. I got sick for several flights in the old SNJ, and we'd get back, and the instructor would go, I got to get rid of you. You're making me sick with just the smell in there. And I would finish a flight and have to clean the plane all out with a bucket and sponge. Thought I'd made a horrible mistake, but lo and behold, I somehow swung around and suddenly found that flying was just great, and I loved it. And I suddenly decided that I wanted to do this forever. It was the most rewarding, and I got into jets, and I was a fighter pilot and photo pilot and a career Marine Corps officer out of all this mess, winning that $10 bet. And that's where I did most of my drinking, was in these fighter squadrons and photo squadrons. And I thought that they were the biggest drinkers in the world. And they'd go out and fly all night and just raise hell, and it was really something. Then I got into AA, and I found out that plumbers are the biggest drinkers in the world. Housewives are the biggest drinkers in the world. And lawyers are the biggest drinkers in the world. So the only conclusion I can draw from this is that alcoholics hang around with the biggest drinkers in the world. And you know why we do this? We do this so to justify our own excessive drinking, and we can just look around and go, my God, my whole world drinks like I do. And that little group needs each other very badly, because for every one of us, there's about 250 out here that are wondering what we're doing over there, getting drunk every day. I would say my career, if you want to call it that, I call it a hobby, went along rather poorly, but I never killed myself, which is kind of redundant. I wasn't getting promoted like other people were. And I've summed this up very quickly as to, I compare myself in these various competitive job things and competition for promotion and so on down. If you were to see the two people who were racing, me and the next guy, it'd be quite obvious who was going to win. Because I was so smart, so capable, it was incredible. When I would apply myself, I could just zoom ahead by miles. It was like a race between the tortoise and the hare. There was no doubt who was going to get the job, who was going to get these things. And then I would get drunk for a week, and the other guy would catch up and pass me and get the job. And I would come back from being off drunk somewhere, and my basic contention was, well, couldn't we run the race over again? And some of the colonels would say, no, Sandy, that's not the way life works. We don't run the race over again. And I came to the conclusion that most senior officers and employers put a high value on people who show up. This is one of the big things. Talent seems to be way down the list. Compared to showing up every day. I don't, what the hell is that? It seemed outrageously unfair to me. Guy, I would think you'd want somebody with all this potential. Potential. That word killed me. I had it in grammar school, doesn't live up to his potential. High school, college, doesn't live up to his potential. I fully expected to hear about it on my honeymoon, but thank God, thank God I didn't. I would have jumped out of the hotel room. What I'm trying to say is that my career didn't interest me too much. I like to fly. I like to get in those planes, and that was a lot of fun. And I compare it, I say it's a hobby because there was about 2 hours a day was devoted to being a Marine, and the rest of the time was devoted to being an alcoholic. It was devoted to recovering from the night before, and it was devoted to getting ready for tonight. And there was this great separation of powers going on. There was this great separation of the mind versus the body. And the body was taking over. And it was a very subtle thing, this alcoholism, the way it progresses. Very little innuendos and very soft nuances as the body wrestled the control from the brain without the brain realizing what was happening. Little threats that would come up from the stomach and go, I think you ought to get a drink down here. And the brain would say, listen, it's only 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We can't put booze down there. And at 2 o'clock, well, I think you better start putting it down here, or something bad's going to happen. And I would go, I'm not taking any threats from you. I have my code of ethics. I have my moral standards. And then the stomach or the brain or something would shoot off one of these twitches that would fly out. And it would go, that's just a warning. That's just a little hint of what's down the road. So the brain would begin to rationalize, and it would begin to look around for someone else who may be drinking during the day. And I finally spotted a guy who had the day off, and he was playing golf and having a beer. And I went, hey, there's a guy drinking during working hours. I guess everybody must do it around here. And I would give in to these various things. I watched my choice of food disappear. I loved to eat big meals and steaks and salads and all those things, but as that alcoholism progressed all the way, and my stomach was so busy handling vodka and orange juice that it couldn't handle heavy food. And it was all right with me. I came up with the fact that perhaps I was too heavy, and that it was a good idea that I couldn't handle heavy food. And the last year of my drinking, I lost 43 pounds and had malnutrition. And I was still going, well, this makes sense to be real thin, and thin people live longer. All of the rationalization as the body took over, and it did. The craving and the necessity for alcohol just became more and more powerful, and it took over all the decision-making process until finally, after I'd been in the Marine Corps about 13 years, I became a daily drinker. I was grounded from flying because I was having withdrawal attacks in a plane, and I would lose my peripheral vision and the heart palpitations and the sweating, and this was the body saying, we don't want you flying, we want you drinking. You can't be up here, you got to be on the ground having a drink. And I was fighting this as best I could, but this was getting absolutely ridiculous. I found myself on one particular flight out of Cherry Point in a Crusader, flying with one hand on the ejection seat because I thought I was going to lose consciousness due to this overpowering feeling. And I finally, after that particular flight, came down and did something I only do when I feel death is imminent, and that is see a doctor. And I was sent from there to, when he heard about what had happened, he became rather nervous and sent me to Pensacola to a special board of flight surgeons, and I lied for 2 weeks and was under the closest observation as to what could cause all of these things. Nothing physical could be found. It was left to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist made the diagnosis of the high blood pressure, the trembling hands, the loss of vision, and the palpitations as a childhood dislike of airplanes. And he told me, we're going to take your wings away, but we're going to retrain you in a new field, and you will never have these problems again. And I knew that this was certainly not true. I knew that I wanted my wings badly. I didn't want to give in to this, but I was unable to even offer the smallest resistance to this. And so I accepted it and left, and it was a wonderful reason to stay drunk for days and days until I was sent to my new school in Glencoe, Georgia, where I went through the FAA Air Traffic Control School to become a GCA controller to bring pilots into the runway when the weather was so bad that they could not see the runways. And I don't know if there's any pilots in the audience, but if there are, I'll just throw one radio transmission out to you to see how it feels. You're on final approach on a GCA, and your final controller says, you're approaching GCA minimums. That's bad transmission. But at this point in time, my brain was short-circuiting. I would sit there and I would see several other things appear on the radar scope, which was confusing me, which were probably the DTs or something, I don't know. But it was a terrible thing, and it was under this situation that I was sent overseas for my last year of drinking in charge of an air traffic control unit. Fortunately, I was in charge, which means you don't have to do anything, and I did recognize the potential danger of me on a scope, and I sort of became an administrator and sat back running things and got into daily drinking, and that's when I lost all that weight. I was unable to eat. My absolute choice over eating was taken away from me. I would forget who I was. I would forget that I was a guy who threw up every morning to start the day, who went in and set his alarm 30 minutes ahead of everybody else just to throw up. I had accepted throwing up. Okay, you're going to wake up. You know why I threw up in the morning? Because I was still me, and life was still the way it was the day before. And just that thought made me throw up. That's how I felt about life. And sometimes I would make the most regrettable mistake. I would finish throwing up. I would get a drink to stay down. I would be starting to shave, and I would say, oh, I think I'll brush my teeth. And I would pick a toothbrush up, and I would brush the front ones, which was all right. But when I went for those back ones, I started the whole morning over again with and I would snap the toothbrush in half and throw it away and go, why the hell can't you remember you're not supposed to brush your teeth? I'd write myself a little note, don't brush teeth, and put it in my pocket. I had all these little notes, buy booze, don't brush teeth, try and sleep, vitamins, juice. I had all these little notes, hide. And shaving became a nightmare. Life was such a nightmare because of the little things. It wasn't the big things, it was the little things. Shaving for me was, I should have gotten an electric razor. It was the obvious answer. The shakes had gotten so bad that my tongue shook when I would stick it out to look at. I would see a strange color in my mouth. I thought I might have a book or something, and stick it out. It was my tongue. I never saw that color before. And I would try and go up with a mirror close and look at it, and the thing was just shaking all around. I just shook all over. The shakes had set in, and sweating all the time, no matter what the temperature was, 20 below zero. I'm in shirt sleeves sweating. People asking, are you all right? Complete strangers, are you all right? Can we help you? Fine, I'm the officer of the day. Huh? Right. And shaving was one of the small things that just gave me a fit. And I finally solved the problem by going in the morning, getting the lather on my face, hold the razor with both hands, because if you recall, if you press tight against each other, you can stop the shaking a little bit. Put my elbows on the shelf above the sink and move my face. And that would be the only way that I could get any shaving done. I explained my problems away the best that I could. I tried to tell myself, tomorrow this is going to go away. Tomorrow you're going to be all right. Even this lie became almost unbelievable to me. My ability to rationalize just couldn't stretch itself to those limits. One particular Saturday afternoon, I had passed out for a period of a couple hours, which permitted my alcohol level to drop below that acceptable standard. I tried to keep it just at that point where you're not drunk and you're not shaking. And this sleep had allowed it to drop way down below, and I woke up in a panic and reached for a bottle of vodka, and it was empty. And right next to the bottle was a note that said, don't let this bottle get empty, an urgent little reminder. And I looked at my watch, and I had 4 minutes to get to the package store before it closed for inventory for 3 hours. And I can remember jumping up and trying to get clothes on, and I got dressed, and then I had my shoes to put on. And I had taken them off after I had walked through some mud and muck, and the laces were still knotted, and it had dried, and leather shrinks, and I was working with a fork frantically trying to get those things out, and looking, I had 90 seconds to go. It was like an Alfred Hitchcock thriller. I didn't know if I'm going to make it over there, and the trembling, I felt a heart attack coming on just getting those shoelaces undone. And finally I managed to get them undone and got on a bicycle and got over to the package store, just in time to get the vodka, and came back, and as soon as I poured the drinks in, all of a sudden there wasn't a problem. And I remember standing there going, I wonder what I was so upset about. I wonder what was so terrifying only 15 minutes earlier. And my conscience said, wait a minute. Here you are, a grown man, 33 years old, captain of the Marine Corps, 6 kids, and you're standing around a damn Quonset hut with a fork in your hand trying to undo knots, and they're going to give you a heart attack. Your life is a mess, and you've got to do something about it today. And I can remember that emphasis on today. And I thought about it, and I sat down, and I used the best logic I had in my brain, and I felt a smile come over my face, and I got on my bike, went over to the PX, and bought a pair of loafers. And came back with that smug look of a person who has just solved a difficult problem. And I had trouble with the second step. The year ended, and I was sent to a career school in Quantico to become the next commandant of the Marine Corps. And I was sitting in this career school listening to a lecture when my body suddenly stood up. I had no intention of standing up at this particular time. My body stood up, went rigid, and had a convulsion. And convulsions are very difficult to have quietly off on the side. And my alcoholism had been brought to the attention of the United States Marine Corps. And I was sent to Bethesda Naval Hospital to find out what could have caused the convulsion. And after 20 hours up in the tower and under observation, I went into the DTs, which explained what's caused the convulsion, and got a straitjacket, and I came to a couple of days later in a bed with sides on it, like a crib, just like a baby. And someone had wet the bed. And I was back in the section where you don't have any matches or razor blades or belts or sharp objects, and the door only could be opened from the outside. And there was about 4 of us back there in that maximum security area. And you know, anybody else been on back there? You remember how you chain smoke 24 hours a day? You have to keep it going, you know, because when you went out, you had to wait an hour for a corpsman to come in with a match to get the cigarettes going again. And we just chain smoked 24 hours a day till we were finally let out of there and got in with the rest of the crowd out into the open ward. And I didn't know where I was. I was in absolute confusion over this, and I found a very kindly little gentleman in a blue bathrobe. And I went over to him and I said, who are you? And he said, I'm Commander Brown, United States Navy. I said, where am I? He said, you're in the psychiatric ward of the Bethesda Naval Hospital. And I said, well, what are you doing in here? And he said, well, I have schizophrenic tendencies with paranoid overtones. He said, what about you? And I said, well, I've been drunk. And the man looked at me like I wasn't even there, and he wouldn't even talk to me again. And I started to sense there was a certain pecking order in the nut ward. And the next guy that I met was a very young Lieutenant J.G., very junior to me. And he was in there, and I went up to him, and this time I had looked at a metal plaque or a card on the bottom of my bed, and it had all this big medical language, and I was ready. And when he told me what he had, I listened very knowingly, and then he said, what about you? And I sort of stood up as best I could, and I said, I happen to have chronic alcoholic syndromes. And he said, oh, drunk, huh? And he didn't talk to me for the rest of the time in there. And you know, those damn nuts at group therapy session, when it would come around to an alcoholic, you know what they would say? They would say, "Why don't you stop drinking?" Well, that shows you how weird they were. Said, "You don't have a problem, you ought to stop drinking." A corpsman came in one night after we'd been there about 4 months. He said, "All you drunks fall in." Right face. And I was at my first AA meeting. And I hated it. I just resented being there, resented the guy who was talking. And I went up afterwards in a very condescending manner and said, "I enjoyed listening to what you had to say. I think you have the answer to alcoholism. If I ever run into a guy with a problem, I'd like your permission to send him over to see you." And he looked at me, he's a little red-headed guy, and he gave me the first contact I'd had with honesty and truth in a long time. Because he poked me in the chest and he said, "Hey, Mac." You know, we love that, to be poked in the chest and called, "Hey, Mac." He said, "Let me ask you one question." He said, "One of us is going to put his overcoat on and go out to the car and drive on home to his family, and one of us is going to put his little blue bathrobe on and get in the elevator and go upstairs and get locked up like an animal. Now, which are you?" And I tell you, I resented that guy until I got out of there, and I drank at him. That's how bad I felt about him. And after being locked up for 4 months, my health had returned, and I got out, and the alcoholism returned in a matter of hours. And I was shaking and hiding booze and bringing it into the nut ward. And just, and the doctors had said, "If we ever have another drink, that's the end of your career." And they were wrong. My career didn't end until I'd been in AA 2 years, and then I got thrown out of the Marine Corps. So they said it was something about my past drinking. Anyway, I kept this up for about 4 days, and the world seemed like it was going to end. And I made a phone call one Saturday morning because the drink wouldn't stay down, and I called Intergroup. And they sent a big Marine around. He was the only other member of AA at Quantico. And he came into my house, and he took over. He just walked in, he said, "Oh, I'm Bill, and take that drink and pour it down the sink." And I said, "Wait a minute, I didn't explain anything yet." And he said, "I don't need any explanation. Pour the drink down the sink, we got a lot of talking to do." And I felt kind of nervous about this guy coming in and taking over like that, but he was big. He was big. And he was sort of mean looking. And I decided I would go along with what he had to say until I could get rid of him. Because I thought about the teeth and the fist and the whole thing. And what we had was one fear out-fearing the other fear. And I went along with him to a meeting. And I hated the meeting. And I'd been sober for 4 hours when the meeting started. And you remember how it is when 4 hours and the need for that drink and the itching and scratching and the hurting. And then he took me home and he said, "Okay, you get out, don't drink, I'll pick you up tomorrow night at the same time." Bam! And drove off. And I was just getting ready to tell him about my busy social schedule and all the engagements I had. And I said, "Well, I'll get him the next night." So I stayed sober until he got me and I was going to get rid of him. But my brain worked so slowly that I would think a thought, and then the process would start and it would come up and he would say, "Okay, get out, don't drink, I'll pick you up tomorrow." And he's gone. And I was rehearsing to beat him to the punch, and I never beat him to the punch. I don't think I could beat him to the punch today. So I stayed sober for 3 months out of fear of sponsor. It was that simple. And I'm glad I had that kind of a sponsor. He's the kind of guy who said, if you need an opinion, I'll give you one. He's the guy that taught me how to read the big book. He gave me the big book and he says, you see this sentence here, what does it say? And I said, well, it says alcoholism is fatal. He said, what does that mean? I said, well, what it means is in certain instances, the allergy to this particular medical phenomenon could result in the heart stopping in a certain individual, and that would be the end. He said, no, that's not what it says. It says, Sandy's gonna die. That's what it says. He had a way of getting me into this thing. He had a way of making things relevant to me, and until they become relevant to us as individuals, it's nothing more than an intellectual discussion on the disease of alcoholism. And then one day we go, oh, you're talking about me. Oh, I see. Oh, I didn't realize that. Somewhere around the third month in this program, I got interested in listening. Something happened. Someone said something, something got my attention, and I no longer was in that pure temporary membership category. I felt that maybe I was almost deserving of listening a little bit in this program. And I noticed one common thread was amongst all the exciting, interesting people that I met in AA, they all had one thing in common. They all said that they owed their joy of living and their new outlook on life to the 12 steps. And so very reluctantly I got the 12 and 12 and went home. I said, well, I think I'll get what they have. And I took all 12 steps in 45 minutes and waited for the spiritual awakening. And waited and waited. And nothing happened except that I became familiar with lots of words in the steps and had made a beginning at the new life. Later on, I went to lots of step meetings, and I came to one of the steps which I'd like to touch on, and then I'll sit down because I know I've gone too long. I came through the first and second without too much of a problem, and I came to that third step. It said something about turning my life over to the care of God. And I went, uh-oh. And suddenly came rushing back all the millions of years I got to do in purgatory. What did we have to go into this thing for, just when I had everything going good? And I suddenly panicked. I have never been so frightened in my sobriety in my whole life. I thought about that step and I said, this is it. And I got a hold of this sponsor and I was telling him, I said, I can't turn my life over. I got a problem here. And he fell down in hysterics, which was his normal way of handling me. He said, you're worried about turning your life over? I said, yeah, I'm worried about turning my life over. He said, let me ask you one question. Who could do a worse job than you do? And I was still an outpatient from the nut ward, and I didn't have the right answer for him. He said, Sandy, we could go out on the street. We could stop the first car coming along. We could say, sir, would you run this guy's life for a year? And we would have a better deal than if you kept running it. We could go to the zoo and get a gorilla with a dartboard. And we would have somebody running your life better than you do. Sandy, the miracle of the third step, if you will take it, is we will remove the management of your life from the hands of an idiot. He said, I strongly suggest you turn your life over to whatever will take it. So God, as I understood him, whatever took it. When I turned it over. And somewhere after 3 or 4 months at an AA meeting, it was like I took a big pack off my back, and I said, you guys want to run this? Go ahead. I'll watch. And it was the greatest moment in my life. I stood back there with a smile on my face I couldn't believe. All of a sudden, I was relieved of all this responsibility. I was relieved of running the world. I was not in charge of the whole thing anymore. And I'd like to thank whatever took that over. I think it's a marvelous job's been done. It's in the hands of professional management, and I feel great about not running that show anymore and not having to run that show anymore. And I feel very grateful of what I've learned here in AA. And to somebody new, I'd love to get back to you and just touch on 1 or 2 thoughts. And that is, if you can let go of that old way of life and let this program happen to you, you're going to find a rather amazing thing will happen. We call it a spiritual awakening. You can call it an attitude change. You can call it a personality change. But when it happens, believe me, it is something. It's generally recognized by people around you even sooner than you may recognize it. Because they may observe that you who come around here negative, oh, no, I don't want to do that, come to me, are suddenly talking about, well, can I help? I'd like to join in. And there seems to be a sparkle in your eye that wasn't there the day before. And there's a change in the vocabulary that you're using. It's gone from very negative to very positive. And nothing else has changed. Nothing in your life has changed materially or physically to support the fact that you should have this attitude change. As a matter of fact, you may be a typical alcoholic who is here, doesn't know where his family is, job prospects, very bad, health, marginal, $3,000 in debt, and you're walking around with a smile on your face. You're walking around talking about how good life is. Now, this doesn't make sense. How could someone in this position talk about how good he or she feels? And in my opinion, it isn't very difficult to fathom. What has happened is the real miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. What has happened is that deep down inside of you, you realize at the most essence of your being that your journey down is over and you're on the way back up. Now, you may see that it's a long way to the top, but just the knowledge that you're going in the other direction produces a smile that won't stop. It's impossible to suppress this new joy and this new attitude. All the years are over, all the penalties have been paid, and you're on the way back up. And if that isn't enough to produce that beautiful smile and that beautiful feeling, is the additional realization that you took that trip down all alone. The most lonely journey in the world is the trip down in alcoholism. And now you're taking the trip back up with all of the beautiful people in this room and in all the rest of Alcoholics Anonymous. People who will stick their hand out and grab a hold of you and say, don't worry, I've been through that road myself. Hang on, we'll go through it together. And if you stay in the middle of Alcoholics Anonymous, you cannot slip off the edge. If you stay in the center of the activity, you will be swept along with the movement of Alcoholics Anonymous. And eventually you'll get through the basic training phase of go to meetings, don't drink, go to meetings, don't drink, go to meetings, don't drink. And you'll get into the real meaningful part of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'd like to just comment on your theme in all our affairs. One of my favorite pieces of literature in Alcoholics Anonymous is A Member's Eye View of AA. I think that author is a genius and I just love to read and reread it. And I reread it tonight before I came down here, and I noticed that on the last page where he says, if there is any shortcoming that I feel in Alcoholics Anonymous, it is in the fact that we have not tapped the potential of the last 7 words of our 12th step, which says to practice these principles in all our affairs, which to him meant to not only feel perfectly at ease with all of the members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and to finally feel comfortable and equal with another human being, but to open the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous into the real world and to practice these principles out amongst everyone, and to take our place in the dignity of man with everyone. And to me, this is something that you, as a new alcoholic, deserve. You may not think you deserve anything. Your opinion of yourself may be very low, but believe me, after what you've been through, you deserve the best that Alcoholics Anonymous has to offer for you, and believe me, it is sensational. So stand up and take your share. You've paid your price, and it's there for the asking, and I hope you find it during this convention. Thank you very much.